Thank you very much, Eric, for that kind introduction, and Ashoka for letting me be here and drone on for what will hopefully be an enjoyable hour. So I hope that this exposes you to some very interesting technology that might serve to benefit your future career as social entrepreneurs. But even if it doesn't, I hope it's a fun presentation. So let's get to it. Like all of you, I've seen a whole bunch of TED Talks, and I know that in order to maintain audience engagement, one has to hyperbolize early and hyperbolize often. So here is my crazy quote of the day. I'm going to try and convince you that this is true, and then offer some reasons why this particular brand of technological innovation could really transform the developing world. But first off, who am I to make such an outlandish, crazy claim? Not a venture capitalist. Well, clearly, whoever I am, I'm a bit biased. I'm an early adopter for pretty much all technology. In Bitcoin's case, I've followed it for about 4 years or so, and I've built projects incorporating it since then. I'm a technologist. I spent most of my life and career working in technology. I did tech product management for the Washington Post in their labs group. I co-founded an Android application startup, and then I went to Stanford Business School to pursue tech entrepreneurship. I love open source. I did my 2007 undergraduate thesis on my other major, political social thought, on Wikipedia. I post a lot of writing. It's all Creative Commons licensed. So basically, I'm just a really big nerd, but not in the kind of LOL, check out my Tumblr of thick-rimmed glasses kind of way. I mean, like a real nerd. So what I am not, and this is full disclosure, I am not an expert on the developing world. To reinforce this point, I even wrote this myself, lampooning technologists who claim that they are experts in the developing world. I think it's good to be a little bit self-aware. But I have spent my career really identifying outlandish, counterintuitive opportunities, and I think Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in particular, and in the developing world, is a really tremendous opportunity. So with that out of the way, and hopefully y'all suitably hyperbolized for the rest of this, here's a little roadmap for the presentation. I'm going to focus more on Bitcoin, the technology, and its advantages than necessarily its applications in the developing world, but I'm hoping that you guys, with your pointed insights and questions, might fill in the gaps there for me. Speaking of which, we're going to be covering some pretty crazy, difficult to understand material. So if at any point I'm going too fast, or you have questions, or want me to elucidate on some topic, please raise your hand, interrupt me, ask. It'll probably benefit everybody in the group. Okay. So first, before we dive into Bitcoin, let's cover some very loose financial history to provide a little bit of context, all right? Let's take our imaginary mental time machines and warp ourselves back to medieval Venice. There's gondolas, there's masks, there's canals, you're loving it. Now let's exercise that imaginary power just a little bit more. So you're the ruler of the Venetian city-state. You are the Doge of Venice. I hope your image of the Doge of Venice is exactly the same as mine. Anyway, you're thinking to yourself, Doge, I have such wealth, much gold, wow, but I don't want to lug around all this gold to purchase mercenaries for my new estate. Now, why do you use gold in the first place? It's divisible, it's scarce, it's hard to fake, and it's shiny, so that's nice. And those reasons are why in the ancient world it became an excellent store of value and a currency. But the weight of it all and the physical security issues are sort of crazy. So what is a ruler of a city-state to do? Luckily for you, your good friend Mercutio specializes in storing gold, and you trust Mercutio innately, especially since he started using double bookkeeping accounting, which was another Venetian competitive advantage. And apparently everybody else loves Mercutio, so everyone starts using Mercutio to store their gold. Now you can basically just give someone a note that says, here, redeem this 10 bars of gold at Mercutio's. And what we've effectively done is metaphorically created the modern financial system, except gold has been replaced by the full faith in a sovereign government to repay its debts, and Mercutio's has been replaced by a labyrinthine system of multinational banks. There's a lot to like about this system. Alongside capitalism and the rule of law, it pulled billions out of poverty, and it led to an exponential technological progress curve. This is a good thing. But to reappropriate that oft-used Winston Churchill quote, our financial system is the worst except for all others that came before it. So let's go back to our good friend Mercutio. He has the trust of an entire city-state, but what if he arbitrarily decides to abuse that trust? Or in a more likely scenario, knowing Mercutio, he unknowingly engages in poor investments. What if Mercutio uses our gold to buy some, quote, totally legit bundles of Danish mortgages from his good friend Horatio that he sells him for some guaranteed return? If only Mercutio hadn't trusted his 15th century Venetian Excel model. If only he knew something was rotten in the state of Denmark, but he didn't. And we, the Doge of Venice, and his other customers wind up losing our precious gold after his investment goes south. Congratulations, we've now effectively metaphorically created a very simple version of the 2008 financial crisis. Pictured here is a decidedly less simple slice of this crisis. I won't go into too much detail because all of us have undoubtedly read a million things about this, but it's pretty easy to see how the crisis caused some pretty epic moral hazard issues and revealed a lot of systemic problems in our financial system. The system is really just fundamentally based on trust. And when that trust is abused, really, really bad things happen. And this is where we get into Bitcoin. So Bitcoin, as you can probably guess, was actually a direct response to the 2008 crisis, even though it had a lot of technological evolution before then. And it's really just a fundamental reimagining of how finance, banking, and money could work in a completely internet-connected age. So as a quick aside, Bitcoin has more political baggage than a Republican VP nominee, but I don't mean to intentionally support a particular political worldview. I'm a progressive, semi-libertarian dude, but I'm much more interested in Bitcoin's technological possibilities than its underlying political message. They're somewhat inextricably linked, so it's hard to talk about one without at least tacitly involving the other, and I just wanted to make that clear before I go any further. So finally, what you've all been waiting for, I'm sure, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is actually really predicated on two extremely simple ideas. One is that trusting third parties leads to abuse, a la Mercutio's rotten real estate investment or the 2008 financial crisis. So Bitcoin says, you know what? I don't want to trust anybody, and I want to operate in a world where I don't trust anybody. Yet, at the same time, the second idea that Bitcoin has is, it's kind of revealing in a way, but Mercutio's value wasn't in his ability to store gold. It was in the fact that he had this ledger that everyone trusted, right? And we all looked at this ledger and said, okay, we agree that Mercutio has valid information about the Doge sending 10 bars of gold to someone else. So Bitcoin says, why don't we take that ledger, make it open, canonical, and global, and make it so that anyone can trust that ledger. So obviously, if you couldn't tell by my color scheme here, the idea of trusting no one and give me a single global ledger that I can trust is pretty much at odds with each other. But the miracle, the technological miracle of Bitcoin is that it takes these ideas as its basis, combines some really clever cryptographic magic and smart incentives, and then, like magic, it really reconciles these ideas and makes them work. Unfortunately, the technology is not quite as trivial to explain in a limited time frame, especially when I'm going to try to keep it as non-technical as possible. That said, this should provide you with a nice overview, but if you're curious, I have a bunch of links that I can send you all later. In the spirit of Bitcoin, if you don't trust me, which I have conflicted feelings about, but I'll send you them along anyway. Okay, so let's start at the most granular level. Let's say Eric gave me some beer, and I want to send him some money for it. This is the canonical drugs for Bitcoin example that the media likes to throw around. If I were to write him a check, the entire process would require both of our bank account numbers, a rather alarming amount of personal information to set up these bank accounts in the first place, and several days. And since neither Eric nor I are licensed proprietors of alcohol, ATF would probably get involved if it were a large enough transaction. In the Bitcoin universe, it's considerably less involved, even though it takes a lot longer to explain. Instead of signing up for bank accounts, Eric and I both have wallet software, which can be open source, meaning anyone can look at the code and sort of verify that it works the way it should. And it most assuredly do not require social security numbers or driver's license or any sort of application process to get it. This software allows us to generate a practically limitless number of public address private key pairs, all of which basically function as individual bank accounts. So this is where I start to lose you, I think, if I haven't already. Public-private key pairs is probably a weird concept and not something you've heard before, am I right? So I'm going to try to explain that as a brief aside. So a public address in the Bitcoin universe, it's a lot like the address to your house. Anyone can see the address, and while they might not know who lives there, they can send items of value to it through the post, right? And they can even peek in the windows and sort of see what's inside. Maybe not that particular address, but others for sure. A private key is like the actual physical key that unlocks the door to your house and gives you access to its valuable contents. And you can choose to send those contents to another house if you want. And that's basically how it works in Bitcoin. I think it's a pretty reasonable metaphor. But what's neat is that unlike physical addresses, Bitcoin's public addresses, the addresses that you have on your wallet software, are lightweight cryptographic constructs, which means that users can generate practically limitless number of them. They can generate like unlimited bank account numbers effectively. And the probability of generating the same pair as someone else is so unlikely that it'll never happen in the lifetime of the universe. So what's actually happening when I send Bitcoin to Eric? In reality, it's not really so much sending as it is reassigning Bitcoin. Effectively, I'm taking my Bitcoin that I have in my address, and I'm sending it or reassigning it to a public address that Eric controls, where Eric has the private key. I do this by signing what's called signing the transaction with my private key. And this is really part of Bitcoin's cryptographic magic here. What's cool here is that anyone can see this transaction. They can see that I signed it, but I never have to reveal my private key. No one can ever know what that private key is, so they never get control of it, effectively. But everyone who sees this transaction knows for a fact that I authorized it. And this is done through what's called one-way functions, and that's an entire cryptographic rabbit hole that we don't need to get into. But again, I can send you guys links if you're interested in that concept. And what I'm describing here is actually not that novel. It's done effectively in lots of other, cryptographic signing is done in lots of other products, especially between two parties. So the tool that Edward Snow, oh yeah, go for it.
So how do people steal your key?
They can. Yeah, so that's actually, when lots of people hear about the Bitcoin network being hacked, it's not the protocol itself being hacked. It's someone who has really bad security on their laptop or their phone, and they have their private key stored improperly or without enough security, and then someone takes that private key and then swipes all their Bitcoin. That's likely what happened with Mt. Gox, for example. So sorry, I've been going through like a steam train here. Does anyone have any other questions? Am I going too fast? Yeah.
As I believe it's now taxable, the Bitcoin, was the initial appeal for you the fact that there was no taxing?
Not on record. But no, I think that, and I cover this a little bit later, when, talking about regulations and smart regulations, and I think that there's a right way to do it, and I and certainly many other people who hold Bitcoin want to pay taxes effectively. I think the way that it's being treated now is really weird, and
It's like a stock and bond.
yeah, exactly. So it's treated like a commodity or a financial instrument, and that's strange when you're trying to actually, so every time, if I were to go, and I've done this before, I actually have bought beer with Bitcoin, believe it or not, and when I do that, I have to note what price I'm selling it at, and then figure out what I bought that in using either some kind of LILO or FIFO accounting method, and backwards out whether I should be paying capital gains on buying that beer, which is stupid. The entire thing is strange, right? So that's sort of there's a very big need, I think, for smart regulation, and that'll happen later. Yep.
This is obviously like a much more simple version, but what's
Yeah.
the difference between Bitcoin and Venmo? If you needed to send money like to someone else, like why use Bitcoin instead of Venmo?
So no, that's a great point. And frankly, in one of the things I think is pretty clear to people, at least in the developed world, the only people that are really interested in the developed world are crazy technologists because they think the technology is so cool. Effectively, there are lots of great options for people who want to send money to their friends and don't want to transact in some weird currency, and they can do it through like Google Wallet, Venmo, PayPal. Now, unfortunately, with all those methods, you are trusting Venmo, for example, with your account number, your bank account. You're trusting them with your identity. You have to sign up. You have to link to your Facebook account. In Venmo's case, I used Venmo for a while, and then they started randomly pushing stuff to Facebook that I didn't approve of, which really creeped me out. And I don't want that, as part of transacting with people. And I think, there are lots of cases where those services, you're placing, it's kind of like that old Mercutio model, you're placing an inordinate amount of trust in those people. And ultimately, even though it might be easier, this model says forget about trusting anyone central. You can trust the network. Yeah.
So in like the news, the way that Bitcoin's price has been fluctuating so much, it does seem a lot like a commodity.
Yeah.
And with that having like a central bank that regulates, the currency and makes sure that like inflation isn't rampant, how do you think that can be addressed in an open source way?
So that's a very good question, and one that I disagree with a lot of economists on, but I actually get to that later. So good question. Okay. So any other questions before I go on? Okay. So what I was describing here with this sort of address transmission, this technology is not that novel. Like signing an address is not that novel. It's what's used in OpenGPG, which was how Edward Snowden did encrypted communication with like Glenn Greenwald. So that kind of technology has existed for a while. This is where it gets mind-blowing. And I do want to take a second to appreciate this awesome animated GIF because I'm a big fan. All right.
Are you active on the Bitcoin subreddit?
Yes, I am.
I figured.
Yeah. It's that obvious. So the transaction that I sign that everyone can tell is authorized by me, remember, without revealing my private key, I don't send it just to Eric. I actually send it to the entire Bitcoin network. It propagates through other Bitcoin nodes, which are just other people on the network, remarkably quickly, and soon the entire network sees our transaction. But why do I send it to everyone instead of just Eric if the transaction was between us? It's because everybody in the network that chooses to has an entire copy of the ledger. It's just so every transaction that ever occurred in the Bitcoin network is on record, and it's called the blockchain, which is well, we'll get into that in a minute. But basically, it's just a giant list of transfers that go from one public address to the next, and you can see the full chain of every transaction all the way to the beginning, where the Bitcoin came from. What's really neat is that anyone can go download Bitcoin wallet software right now and have this entire ledger from the beginning of Bitcoin on their computer. It's about 13 gigabytes or so. And basically the reason it's called a blockchain is because every group of transactions that's added to it is called a block. And it's just this long chain of these individual blocks going all the way back to time T0 when Bitcoin first came out. So this is in stark contrast to the old Mercutio as bank model. Instead of a few trusted parties having their own proprietary ledger, everyone has the same global open canonical ledger. In the old banking world, you'd have to guard your account number and identity pretty carefully. At best, an open ledger was a really dangerous proposition. But in Bitcoin land, because of public-private key cryptography, one never needs to reveal their real identity. They can just generate a new public address and have Bitcoin sent there. And even if they did, no one would ever be able to move that Bitcoin from their public address unless they authorized it, or in the cases the question asked before, someone had bad security and their private key was stolen. So in the Bitcoin world, having an open canonical ledger is actually a fantastic idea. It's the best possible idea. Okay, so there's one last really, really important piece to this puzzle, and it's really a bit of a doozy, which is why I saved it for last. So someone who's been paying attention might be asking, where does the Bitcoin amount come from for that initial amount in those public addresses, right? It sounds like it's just a number in a ledger, in which case, why can't someone just go on and put whatever number they want in there, and then it won't be either scarce or something that's difficult to fake, right? And so remember how I said the blockchain is just this giant list of public address to public address transactions? So reassigning over and over and over again. If you take it all the way back and do a little bit of inductive reasoning, one quickly starts to wonder where this original Bitcoin amount came from. And the answer there is that it comes from the process called mining. And that's where you guys might have heard of Bitcoin miners before. So what does mining actually do? And this, I really tried simplifying this, but honestly, it's really, really confusing. So please stop me if none of this makes any sense. Mining is really a bit of a misnomer. The better phrase would be incentivized securing of the network, but that's a really big mouthful, and no one wants to say that every time they talk about it. So let's go back to all these nodes on the network, all right, with their own copies of the blockchain. While they're collecting transactions, they're listening to all these transactions that are being broadcast all over the network. They're also searching for a solution to a cryptographic puzzle. And if they find a solution, they broadcast an answer to all other nodes on the network. And then the other nodes can easily verify that their solution is accurate without going through all the work of trying to find the solution themselves. This is part of that whole one-way function thing again. Included in that answer is actually all of the new transactions over the network. And thus, that's how a block gets added to that global ledger. And then the miners start working on the next puzzle after listening to new transactions. So in the Bitcoin network, the miners are the ones who are actually adding the pages to that global ledger, but they just say that they're adding blocks to the blockchain. So why would they do this? And the reason is because they are the source of that scarce, limited unit of account that's actually used in the network. Finding this answer requires a lot of computer work, electricity, and hardware. Consequently, everyone on the network has basically agreed to certain rules about how much Bitcoin they're awarded. Right now, it's about 25 Bitcoin, but it decreases exponentially over time. Additionally, miners are also awarded all transaction fees within that block, but that's another sort of side issue that's not as important right now. But what's really neat is that the difficulty of this puzzle that they are trying to find the answer to is adjusted on the fly. Basically, it's corrected about every 2 weeks or so. So based on if there's more mining power in the network, if there are more people trying to find the answer to this puzzle, mining gets harder and harder and harder. Now, the reason that's important is because the harder it is to mine, the more secure the network is. So why does more miners equal more security? Oh, yeah.
So who's creating the puzzle?
It's basically so it's everyone on the network agrees to certain rules about how the puzzle gets created, and the puzzle effectively it's like I don't want to get into too many nuts and bolts, but basically it takes what's called a hash of the previous block, which is like it's like a digest of a summary of everything that's in that block, and then you add like a number of leading zeros to the front of it, and then you try to find an initial solution that satisfies a function where the result is that this is why it is really hard to talk. Oh, tons of people. So just all these mining pools are what they're generally called. But there are plenty of people who find it. So basically the way that miners look at it, if they find a solution to this puzzle, they get 25 Bitcoin, which as of today is equivalent to 15,000, maybe a little bit more. Hold on, 120, yeah, $15,000 or so, ish. My math might be off there, but basically that's a lot of money just to be sitting there doing these problems. The thing is, the amount of computing work that's required to find that answer is really extreme. It's huge, right? And in order to, you wind up spending a lot of electricity, right? And right now, I was actually mentioning this to someone else earlier, the amount of electricity that most people are using to mine makes it not profitable for them to do so. Like they're using roughly $800 to $900 for most people to mine a single Bitcoin, and the market right now will only pay $600 per Bitcoin. So it's really confusing. I'm sorry.
But Josh, just
Yeah.
the key point there is that there's no single computer or
Yeah.
corporation that is responsible for sending out the next puzzle.
That's right. It's not. It's completely decentralized. So there's like large groups of competing miners that are basically attacking this problem simultaneously. And that's where the security actually comes from, is that all these people are competing to try to find this puzzle. So I guess the easiest way to conceptualize it is that everyone is competing with each other. And as I mentioned before, the puzzle that they're trying to find the answer to is fundamentally connected to that group of transactions. So if you try to fake that block, a la fake block over there, and you try to do like a fake page on this ledger, it's going to modify the answer to that puzzle. And then all the other nodes on the network are going to see that fake block and say, no, we are not going to do that because that doesn't follow what the math says the answer should be. And then it doesn't propagate through the network. Now, that said, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but the summary version is that as long as 50% of the mining power is not controlled by one person, you can be pretty sure that the network is secure. There's probabilistically some chances of the network being insecure between 40 and 50%, but generally speaking, as long as 50% doesn't, some one person or one group control 50% of mining power, the network is completely secure, and it's secure in a way that doesn't involve any central computers. It's all done, sort of dynamically, peer-to-peer.
So,
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
if it's not currently economically viable to be mining bitcoins at their current market value, I assume firms are still doing it based on long-term hopes
Yep.
for Bitcoin value.
That's right.
Is there a ceiling? I guess if a Bitcoin eventually is worth $50,000 or $100,000, they're able to put more computing power into it, and there's really no limit to how many Bitcoins can be mined.
So that's not quite true. So it is, you're right in that the reason people are mining it even though it's unprofitable now is that they're speculating that in a year or two it's going to be worth a lot more. And because they have the capacity to do it now, they say, why don't I take the hit and see where this thing could go? The way that that 25 Bitcoin, everyone who's on the network has agreed to rules about how much that reward is. And that reward actually gets halved about every 4 years or so. So initially it was 50 Bitcoin, way back in the early days. And then maybe it was last year it was halved to 25 Bitcoin. In 2018, it'll be halved to 12.5 Bitcoin, then 6.25, math again. And then, continuing on until about the year 2140, when there will be no reward, and miners instead will get money from transaction costs in the network. So that page of ledger, that block that they're putting together includes a bunch of transactions. And ostensibly, if it ever becomes a worldwide currency, those transactions are actually going to be a massive source of potential revenue for miners, which is why people believe that even when that reward is nothing, they'll have, some incentive to continue mining. But if it ever reaches a point where Bitcoin's like $100,000, the mining power, the amount of people mining will be absolutely obscene. It'll be crazy to think about the amount of computing power going into it. But it's an interesting model, and there's still some problems with it, which I'll go over in a little bit as well. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there the potential for someone with access to a supercomputer like the Watson to just go in and just dominate?
Yeah. So right now, and some people have estimated the cost of this. So the Bitcoin network is worth about $8 billion. If someone wanted to sync it right now, they could basically put about I think $300 million or $400 million into an Amazon, supercomputing cluster. Just put it online. I don't think Amazon could actually support that, but they crunched the numbers, and would cost something on the order of that much just to get 50% of the mining power right now for an extended period of time. So yeah, people, if a government, for example, said, I don't like this concept and I want to sink it, there's definitely, I'm sure the NSA has more than enough computing power to do it, but they haven't yet. Yeah.
I'm just sorry. This is like going way back.
No,
If it's not hooked up to your bank account, like
No.
where is it coming from? Like
Yeah.
I just don't understand like how.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
It's like way back.
No. No, that's where mining gets really confused. So actually, the next slide sort of, I think, gives a better overview of what's actually happening. So there's this big network, okay? Miners are securing the network. That's effectively what they're doing. The reason they're competing is to secure the network. And because they're securing the network as a whole has agreed to give them Bitcoin, like that actual amount of Bitcoin. Now, they can go and take that Bitcoin, they can trade it for, beer with Eric, or they can go and find an exchange online that will trade their Bitcoin for other currencies, like yen, euros, dollars, etc. Or they can buy goods and services with it. But what's interesting about it is then the miners then are really the ones in control of fiscal policy. They're the ones who are sending currency out to everyone on the network and saying, yeah, you have this, you have this. And they're also effectively determining the value of the network because they're spending a lot of computer power and electricity to actually secure it. And ostensibly, they wouldn't do that unless it was profitable for them to do so. So it's not like it's not like your bank account is sort of listed anywhere. It's more like you agree to these rules in the network and you decide that you want a place in the global ledger that everyone is sharing, right? And you can put that money in that public address that everyone can see, but only you have control of because you're the one with a private key. Does that sort of
mean
make
that you have to take if you're gonna pull money out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you want to put money into bitcoins, would you put in say one Bitcoin is equivalent to $1?
Well, you'd have
your
to.
math? Would you put money into it and then get
Yeah.
bitcoins and then could use it?
So right now, outside of mining, which would be really hard for anyone to do at this point, other than people who've specialized in it, you would have to go, and this is actually a big challenge in the developing world as well, which I'm going to mention later on. You have to go and find someone who has Bitcoin and who's willing to trade it with you for goods or services or for actual cash. So the way that I've done it is, my favorite company in the U.S. to do it is Coinbase. And unfortunately, doing this actually takes a lot of the spirit away from Bitcoin because in order to exchange cash for Bitcoin in that context, you have to give them your identity and your bank account number and what's the point, So there are a lot of actual legitimate challenges for people who aren't mining who just want to get their hands on this currency to start spending it.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to know what is the largest share of mining power that's being held by one person right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there is a mining pool that, which is just a collection of miners that have agreed to come together to mine sort of as one unit. And it got dangerously close recently to about 50%. So they were at 48% very, very recently. And there's this whole big debate and problem with it. But they've voluntarily, and I can talk about this a little later, but they voluntarily reduced their capacity to 39% because they realize that the incentive to be running an honest mining rig is much stronger than trying to sink the network. It's just hard. I mean, right now, no one can really make money off of sinking the network because there isn't really a big marketplace for shorting, which is more, sort of finance hedge fund people are probably going to get into it eventually. But at that point, it'll be a much larger network and much harder to do something like that.
So there are different branches of kind of Bitcoin, like Dogecoin.
Yeah.
Can you do the trading with Dogecoin, or is that a complete network of its own?
It's a complete network of its own, but
It functions the same way.
it functions the same way. In fact, so there are minor differences between Dogecoin and Litecoin, and the differences are really, what's it?
Africoin?
Was it?
Wasn't there one called Africoin?
I actually haven't heard of that one
Or I
before.
think it was a fake one.
Oh, well, no, I mean, there was it was Kanye coin too, which was for a hot second. It was amazing. I was a really big fan of Kanye coin. But no, all these things, Bitcoin is open source, so anyone can take the protocol, the logic behind it, and create their own network and just sort of tweak things a little bit. And there are even broader attempts to make entirely different computing models off of Bitcoin that I still haven't wrapped my head around that are in the sort of ether now. But yeah, it's fascinating to see how this stuff works because effectively, what's going on here is that there are these people that are competing against each other to mine and making value in doing that. They're putting electricity and computing power in, and they're getting this scarce unit of account out into, the total amount of bitcoins that will ever be generated is 21 million bitcoins. And each of those bitcoins can be subdivided 10 to the negative 8 ways. So like a micro Bitcoin and then 2 decimal places after it. So you effectively just sort of out of nothing created this incredibly valuable network where the value of the network adjusts on the fly depending on how much miners value it themselves. So it's really neat. But any other questions? Okay. So this is Bitcoin in a nutshell. The protocol is just a massive, globally shared ledger that anyone can view, combined with some really neat cryptography tricks to ensure scarcity and security in the network. So that is as technical as I'm going to get. I apologize for dragging you guys through that, but I think in order to really appreciate the advantages of the system, you need to understand how it all works. But before I will mention a few other things in passing, but that's all the hard thinking, I hope. Does anyone have any questions before we, yeah?
So I get what you're saying
Okay.
with the decentralization.
Uh-huh.
But in terms of origination, these numbers that you throw out, this,
Yeah.
Starting 50 and now it's 25,
Yep.
the rules
Yep.
every 4 years and 21 million max. I mean, is there a governing board? Is there a
Yeah.
founder? Is there
So there is. I purposefully neglected to mention the enigmatic founder because that's really more the purview of hit pieces in Newsweek and not actually germane to how the technology works. But the question of governance is an important one, especially when it comes to open source projects in general. And there's a Bitcoin Foundation that started by, originally it was just a bunch of like hackers in the crypto community coming together thinking, oh, this would be neat, let's build this, right? And from then on, it went to being used in things like the Silk Road when there was an immediate advantage to using pseudonymous, private transactions that are harder to trace. And so it sort of grew out of that, and now we're entering this phase in Bitcoin. So there are a group of core developers that wind up deciding a lot of what happens with the protocol. There's certain things set in stone. So the fact that Bitcoin is deflationary and that it has a limited number of units of account, that's pretty much set in stone. And it will take a lot to change that. What's that?
Set by this group of core developers?
By the group of core developers and also the way the protocol is defined. So if someone just effectively you need 50% of the miners to agree to start adding more Bitcoin into the ecosystem. And they have so many reasons not to add more money into the system because that would reduce the potential value for them. Although there are questions about whether having infinite inflation would be good for a cryptocurrency, which is actually how Dogecoin works. It has infinite inflation by a set amount every year. So there are experiments that are done by forking, what's called forking, taking the open source code and creating your own network around it. But in Bitcoin, there are certain things that would be very, very hard to change because there's so many parties that are now invested in it that they wouldn't want to change those things. Now, I mean, it could happen, but I think it's very unlikely to. Yeah.
So instead, do you maybe see people trading like half of a Bitcoin?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So it's all when I bought beer with Bitcoin. If I had to pay a full Bitcoin for it, I would have been outraged because it was $650 or so. So you can actually just take it. Even if you have one Bitcoin, you can subdivide it up to. I paid point. So this is where it gets weird, and also there's cultural adoption problems because I paid like 0.008 Bitcoin for beer. And it's easier to say 8 millibitcoins, but that's because I like math and I don't mind thinking of it that way, but consumers don't, right? And so there's some movements to change that. And talk about micro Bitcoin as the fundamental unit of Bitcoin, because then it would be like 1.05 micro Bitcoin looks a lot like dollars, and that is as far as it can go.
Okay, sorry, I'm just
No,
trying to
no.
wrap my head
Yeah,
around
yeah,
this.
go for it.
So can you explain like that process? So you want to buy beer with Bitcoin.
Yes.
How do you do that?
So now the way that I do it, I have a wallet on my phone. Because I guess I didn't really actually explain how you do that. I explained it theoretically, but not practically. So I have a wallet on my phone, a wallet application on my phone, wallet app. I download it. I set up my private public key there, and then I wind up, either getting from an exchange. I go online and I find an exchange, or I just find someone locally who's willing to trade Bitcoin with me. I give them $20. They give me the equivalent of whatever the market rate is, $20 of Bitcoin, and then he transfers it to the public address on my phone. Boom, it's listed. My private key is on my phone, but I could store it elsewhere if I wanted to. But since it's on my phone, I now go to, a local beer hall. They have a merchant point of sale system that accepts Bitcoin, which obviously is a rarity, and not many people have that, and that's a big challenge as well for adoption. I go, and what they actually do, it's pretty neat. Once you see it working live, it's pretty amazing, because all they do is they just basically create a QR code, and that QR code has a very specific, it has a format associated with it, so they will charge me the exact right amount that I need to. I just scan that QR code and I press a button, and that's it. It's transferred. I mean, and all it's doing is my phone is transmitting to the Bitcoin network. That QR code gave me all the information I needed to know. It gave me their public address, how much I needed to pay them, and then from my phone, I am signing it, that signing thing as I described before, with my private key, and then sending that signed transaction out to the rest of the network. And then he sees it on his machine, and I see it on my machine. And that's it. Yep.
For example, if you lost your phone or something like that,
Yeah.
how
So yeah, if you lost your phone and you had your private key on there, then someone could steal your Bitcoins, which is why you don't store a lot of Bitcoins on your phone. But there are other ways of storing. So I actually use Coinbase generally because it keeps things, I trust their security more than I trust my own, which is a third-party sort of anti-Bitcoin thing to think of. But effectively, like, they are the ones controlling my wallet, and when I do that, if I lose my phone, I can take away access to my Bitcoin wallet through their online interface. But there's so many of these sort of cultural issues and security issues at the consumer endpoints that make it a big challenge for adoption as well. So any other questions on how it works? Okay. Here we go. Finally to the good stuff. So why would anyone choose to transact in Bitcoin, especially in the developing world? Some of these advantages are probably self-evident from what I've already talked about, but let's dive in. So first and foremost, let's talk about sort of the abstract big picture advantages. It is fundamentally the most radically transparent open financial system in existence, bar none. The ledger, that blockchain, is completely open, has been downloaded by thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of computers, all of which are constantly updating it with new transactions. No other system really comes close to being this open, especially in the financial world. There are some caveats, like off-chain transactions are things that are cleared by a third party, but then are inserted back into the blockchain. But even when you factor those in, Bitcoin is incredibly transparent compared to any other financial system. And particularly in those in developing or repressive regimes. And all of this is sort of open source, and so you can see the code and validate it and audit it. So what's amazing, though, despite that openness in the system, it can preserve anonymity if you're careful, and even when engaging in online transactions. So this is generally viewed as a mixed bag by lots of people. I'm more of an optimist, and I think it can be a real power for good. Obviously, there are cases where, like the Silk Road and illicit goods were transacted in Bitcoin, and it's a great use case for that. But I think it can be used for good as well as evil. So what if you needed to fund a journalist in a repressive regime that has a Bitcoin-based black market? You can do that from anywhere in the world. What if you wanted to donate to a cause that wasn't really considered all that kosher by an authoritarian government? You could do that. Or what if you wanted to pay a government official without their corrupt boss taking a cut? These are the kinds of use cases. I mean, I've read an amazing article about, again, I'm not an expert in the developing world here, but about Afghani police officers and how converting to an electronic transmission system for their payments ended up improving reducing a lot of corruption and improving sort of the safety in the district where they tried that. So there are huge, huge use cases for this in the developing world. So it takes fiscal power away from governments and in math and puts it in math and computers, which again might be a mixed bag and certainly not really needed in the developed world where we have rule of law and stable governments. But in the developing world, there's a huge potential advantage here. I'm not really sharp on theories of development, as I mentioned, but I am familiar with the concept of chicken or egg problems. And when it comes to the developing world, I've heard this, that citizens need good institutions and rule of law in order to have a thriving economic system, but seemingly the reverse is also true. And they need a thriving economic system in order to get to a point where they can have those sorts of institutions to support it. So properly applied, to me, Bitcoin is like the Konami code of, that's a cheat code to anyone who's too young to play Nintendo, but for places without laws or institutions that support reasonable fiscal policy. So it's not without its challenges, like getting local currency exchanges and getting people to actually support the system and understand it is kind of difficult. But I think that those challenges are more surmountable than, say, the challenges of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. Okay.
For the system to work, people have to have access to the internet, to have access to phones.
Yes, they do, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute because that's absolutely right. Because there are some interesting technologies that let people use Bitcoin with limited connectivity, like a Finnish television station just started broadcasting the blockchain using a TV signal. And so this entire account ledger, just this one-way transmission of the entire global network of Bitcoin is being transmitted through open available, wireless that wasn't being used by any other source. And if you combine that with even 2G wireless, it's possible to engage in Bitcoin transactions. SMS is a little harder, but I think the smartphone thing that's something that's going to change soon. So this last one is really more for me to geek out, but I think it's very important for you guys as well. So it creates money, this massive opportunity for money as an API. An API is an application programming interface. And so what this really means, this is the thing I get most excited about and could potentially be a huge deal. So Bitcoin was designed to work electronically. It was designed to work with computers in mind. It can't really work without them. Consequently, working with Bitcoin means it can be manipulated like a lot of data online. That is to say, programmatically. So something I didn't touch on, but there's this entire realm of Bitcoin scripting, like a scripting language within the protocol that lets you do some pretty cool things. You can create escrow accounts without a bank. You can create companies that programmatically distribute dividends. You could associate Bitcoins with physical property. So you could say that this Bitcoin is associated with this car, transfer that Bitcoin, and then someone else owns that car. Or you can even create a decentralized version of Kiva or Kickstarter. All these things are possible, and that's only the stuff that we can think of today. Unlike regular money, which has always been a closed system with not much opportunity for tinkering, this protocol is wide open for that sort of stuff, which actually has led to the proliferation of other altcoins like Dogecoin and Litecoin and all these other networks, which is open competition, which is another good thing. So I really can't emphasize this point enough. What gets me excited about technology in general is that in addition to the opportunity to inject internet memes into serious presentations, is that occasionally an idea comes around that creates an entirely new, completely unforeseen platform. It happened with DOS, then Windows, and the World Wide Web, then the iPhone, smartphones. It's never been possible with money until now. And that's why Bitcoin excites me so much. Not because of what it is today, it excites me for what it could become, the sort of undreamed ideas that could be built on top of it. Okay, so let's dial back the techno-utopianism and get back to brass tacks. So those abstract advantages aside, here's some more practical advantages for Bitcoin today. So it provides electronic banking services for significantly cheaper cost, with or without a bank. On any Android phone today, you can download an open source wallet. So as I mentioned before, what's interesting about this and why I think it matters in the developing world is that we're reaching a point now where the same kind of smartphone experience that we have in the developing world is going to be in the developed world is going to be in the developing world. So their Moto E was just released in India that's under $100. That's not quite in the realm of affordability yet, but we're getting close enough that people can have access to Android phones that are nearly as fully featured as the ones that we're used to. And that means that you can start to develop these new services and experiences for people in the developing world, which is amazing. So it'll present all sorts of amazing challenges and opportunities. But I think the biggest opportunity is sort of the underbanked, people who never had access to banks before. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Kenya's M-Pesa system. Oh, there we go. So M-Pesa was this electronic money banking system that was unveiled in Kenya, I think around 2006, 2007, and it was completely SMS-based. And it basically took an entire half of the population that had never even touched a bank account and made them digital banking natives within a couple of years. And so that kind of opportunity is here, but on a worldwide scale, because it's one single currency and unit of account. So even in places with banks, Bitcoin can cater to those who are underserved, or as a buffer to predatory banking practices. So just to expound on this for a moment, it takes a special kind of rationalized insanity to appreciate that in most places, it costs more money to bank when you have less money. Just think about that for a moment. That's like patently absurd. That shouldn't happen. And in Bitcoin, it's agnostic to that. It doesn't care about credit rating. It doesn't care about what your bank thinks you can have on your checking account or what overdraft fees you need to make. Bitcoin can exist as electronic money that doesn't have any of these sort of issues associated with it. So, one currency, one love, y'all. Bitcoin has no borders. You need local infrastructure to support it. You need,
But could potentially, like, people using Bitcoin in underdeveloped countries, could they become targets with the security force?
Yeah, and therein lies a huge sort of educational and I think security challenge, because you're going to have to figure out how to make it. It's an esoteric system, and you're going to have to figure out how you can actually take it and make it work for people with just limited smartphones. So that's a huge open challenge, which maybe I'll get to. I don't know. I'll keep going, and you'll have to leave. I'm sorry that I took all this time. And now transactions are also significantly cheaper, and I'm just going to very briefly talk about this because it really also angers me. Visa's case, if you want to send $10 to someone, it costs 30 cents, roughly. If you want to send $10,000, it costs $300. Western Union, if you're talking about remittances, if you want to do $10,000 at the upper end, it will cost you $1,200 to send that money. This is crazy. This is insane. This shouldn't happen, right? All they're doing, and now granted, they're taking some sort of risk associated with the amount of currency and the insurance issues, but even so, they're taking one part of a spreadsheet and moving it to another and charging a percentage for the number in that cell in the spreadsheet. That is also absurd and shouldn't happen. And in Bitcoin, that doesn't happen. I can't really speak to how the transactions work, but they're getting changed soon. But effectively, it will be significantly cheaper. I even saw in the past someone transferred the equivalent of $150 million in the Bitcoin blockchain for $0. And they could have probably put in $10 and then gotten it to confirm quicker, but they didn't need to. And that's not always going to be true, but that's just sort of a stark example of how much cheaper it can be and it should be. Okay, so now to put the brakes on my infectious enthusiasm, or at least qualify it. Now, if all of what I said about Bitcoin was true, then at this point it would have taken over the world. We'd be riding solar-powered unicorns to work, and all world hunger would have been sated by the discovery of edible rainbows. None of this has happened. I'm still holding out hope for the rainbows. Bitcoin has had remarkable growth in 5 years of existence. It went from $0 to an $8 billion marketplace. But there are a lot of challenges that remain, specifically technologically, regulatory, economic, and cultural. So let me just go into those. I'm still very excited about Bitcoin, but, oh, oopsie, sorry. So there are some known technological issues that make Bitcoin kind of challenging. One of those, right now, we know that the currency, and I'm sorry, if you guys got to go, I will try to wrap it up. I'm sorry to be taking too much of the time. Almost. Okay. Thank you. So I will try to wrap this up as soon as possible. There are issues right now that prevent Bitcoin from truly becoming a global currency. It can't transact at the same volume as dollars or euros or yen today. But these are technological challenges and ones that I'm confident will be solved. There's a saying in the open source community, with enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. And the meaning behind that is that as long as more people are looking at it, they will find solutions to these problems. Now, the one that's a little bit harder is that whole 51% attack. And as I think I mentioned earlier, maybe someone's question, I can't remember. But there are cases where there have been mining pools that have gotten close to 50%. And that's happened a number of times in Bitcoin's life. It has never resulted in sort of a shutdown of the protocol, but it's gotten close. And so that needs to be solved, and lots of very smart people who are heavily incentivized to find a solution because they hold lots of Bitcoin are trying to find a solution. Okay, here's a fun game you can play with an economist. Tell them that Bitcoin is not a commodity or a currency. Instead, say it's a bit of both and something more. This will likely upset them. Based on how upset they become, guess which school of economics they belong to. And once you play this game a few times, I think you can figure out exactly who they are. But I'll leave that as an exercise to you guys. So look, I'm just going to say it outright. A lot of modern economics and Bitcoin just does not agree flat out. Like, there are so many people, any economist will tell you that scarce units of account are not as good as a flexible money supply. But I have a sneaking suspicion that they say this to keep themselves at cushy jobs in central banks. So I think there's an incentive problem there. But okay, I'll stop making fun of economics, because as I mentioned before, economics has done a lot of good, and I think there's a lot to be said about flexible money supply and central banking, and it's done a great deal of good for the world. And I'll admit the idea of a volatile deflationary currency is not really ideal when it comes to transacting. And certainly not what most economists think constitutes an ideal vehicle for society's transactions. But I think the end game, where Bitcoin will eventually lead to, will not look like that. I think that most of the hope, the reason that there are lots of very smart people investing in it and the concept, is that they believe that that deflation that's happening will actually end up being around the level of inflation today, so 1% to 2%. And in that world, we have never really been in a world that has the same kind of properties as Bitcoin's deflation, where we know definitively what the money supply is. In our old gold run economies, the discovery of a single mine could crash entire societies, right? That's not going to happen with Bitcoin because there's full awareness of how much currency is available, how much unit of account is there. There's still challenges here, but I think that these can be overcome. And it might not be Bitcoin, it might be an alternative cryptocurrency that has very different rules on how much currency gets added to the system. Okay, Bitcoin is the Wild West of finance, and this bothers lots of people for good reason. They've spent years taming our financial system and doing so for the benefit of consumers, at least in intent, if not outcome. So they want to regulate Bitcoin. And from their perspective, rightfully so. So the Silk Road and the Mt. Gox collapse are just huge, massive examples of the myriad of Bitcoin companies and shadow economies that have sort of collapsed on themselves. And governments want to protect their citizens from that sort of stuff, and that's completely reasonable. Now, unlike most of my crypto anarchist friends, who I don't have many of, I personally believe there is a place for smart government regulation with Bitcoin. But the government record has been mixed at best. Whether it's malicious or out of ignorance, I don't know. But most recently, the New York State Department of Finance released some regulations, proposed regulations for Bitcoin businesses, and they're just really, really bad. Just a single example of this. My favorite Kafka-esque absurdity with it is that if these regulations had existed before Bitcoin had been created, it would have been illegal to make Bitcoin. That's not going to work. Like, that just seems screwed up. So there are other countries, worldwide. There have been issues with regulation where it's just very mixed and volatile. So Russia and China have both at times banned and then unbanned Bitcoin, like several times. I'm sure there are a variety of places in the developing world that wouldn't really have a good opinion on what they should do with it. And this presents a challenge to anyone trying to build stuff there. But ultimately, I think it's still going to work. Bitcoin is going to exist, even if it doesn't have regulatory approval. Much like other protocols, like BitTorrent, which some of you may be familiar with. The Pandora's box is pretty much open, and there's no way that you can stuff this mixed metaphor genie back into the bottle. So without light and smart regulation, Bitcoin will only become a shade of what it could become. And that'll be a detriment to everyone, especially the third world. So I think it's very important to sort of focus on those groups and try to create smart regulation. Okay.
Josh, we actually
Gotta cut it, I'm sorry. Last part, I spent more than an hour trying to explain this to you guys, and it's very hard to understand. This, I think, is the biggest challenge that you face, like trying to understand it and trying to get people in the developing world too. So thank you guys so much. I'm so sorry that I went way over, but I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. I'm really glad I got to come here. So thanks so much.